Good afternoon, everyone. We're here to talk a little bit today about what happens when you bring something like Pivotal to an enterprise that's 30 years old, has a huge portfolio of legacy applications kind of beyond the 0 to 8 year time frame, and how you're actually going to bring in kind of the culture change and what we're going to be dealing with that. Don, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Don Fossgreen. I'm the principal platform architect at West. I was brought in about a year ago to head up this initiative.
Cool. My name's Thomas Squeo. I'm a senior vice president of digital transformation and enterprise architecture. And I think Don's observation is that the more syllables, the difference in importance in the organization. I actually say it's the difference between how far away from the problem you actually are. So, a little bit about West Corporation. West Corporation is a Fortune 1000 company, 848 actually. We're about a $2.5 billion a year enterprise. About 50% of our business comes from overseas, not US based, North America. We primarily are a global telecommunications company. We do, our most notable business is our unified communications business, our safeties business, which includes the 911 system for North America. We have a notifications business under our interactive services umbrella, which includes commercial, utility, education, and healthcare notifications. So if you think about everything ranging from a pharmacy pickup to appointment reminder to whether or not you're going to have an outage in your area from due to a power line or something along those lines. We also have a agent services business, which includes all of the things that necessary to run a call and contact center, IVR systems and things of that nature. And then we also have a component around healthcare, and then lastly around telco services, where we actually operate as a wholesale carrier for many of the large telcos in the world. West as an organization, about 30 years old, started in '87. We acquire approximately 5 companies a year. We've gone through a pretty interesting transition from a transformation perspective around with an acquisition by a private equity firm called Apollo Group. We concluded that transaction in October of this year. But the most important aspect of that is that it kind of, we had built a transformation agenda that was kind of aggressive, but then what happened was we found that we started to see the stamina kind of wane a little bit. And what happened is that once the acquisition was announced and we were knowing we were going to go from public to private, we found a renewed energy around how we actually execute around that transformation agenda. And that transformation agenda is largely driven from an inside-out strategy, meaning what are the efficiencies we can gain, how do you modernize the technology stack, how do you look at business processes around things like service management or operations management, how you're actually dealing with how infrastructure is provisioned and automated and so on and so forth. But most importantly in that is we actually viewed a hybrid cloud strategy and a cloud native platform, being able to adopt a platform as a services strategy that we're going to basically go through with you today. So, next slide. So as we kind of look at the challenges and opportunities for the organization, and feel free to step in whenever you want to push me off the stage. For the most part, everybody here has been through some kind of virtualization environment. So our average time from request to operationalization for our virtualized environment was about 60 days. That 60-day period was a period of extreme frustration in the linear ticketing process that was our service desk. We saw, slow to respond, draconian process, our controls and governance controls around how things can move between private cloud and public cloud. For the most part, our public cloud utilization was largely what we consider to be shadow IT or business-led IT. What happened was most of those organizations ran significantly faster than we did at the core. So what we found was that these folks that are out at the extremities of the business that were out of alignment with the core governance of the business were actually out functioning, out operating, and out executing us at every turn. And they were part of our own organization, but felt that they couldn't actually talk about that internally. So, Don, you want to speak to that a little bit?
So this happened because of the number of acquisitions that we had across the years. And some of them were really forward-facing companies doing DevOps, agile practices, CI/CD pipelines, et cetera. and others were coming in asking, could we get a faster punch card machine? Well, not really, but. And our idea was to raise the level of the whole ocean. We needed to have some way to bring everybody up, not just help the people who are at the front of the curve, and not just bring up the back end, but level everyone up. And because we're a big company, we had a lot of complicated processes, and complicated processes bring complicated organizations. You not only had to figure out who to talk to, but who within the group to talk to. And then within the group, you'd go through many stages. You'd need to find someone to design it, someone to acquire hardware, someone to actually install on it, someone to monitor it. And it's times like those that you sort of just wish you were back in the days of the Dark Lord with his one ring who could say, let's just do it together.
Well, what's funny is I actually called the corporate governance the Eye of Sauron too, so we would see things that people didn't want us to see. One of the things that happened for us was actually my boss, the CIO for the company, said to me, we had a significant amount of infrastructure investment. We have about 40 data centers that are larger than 10,000 square feet throughout the globe. And we had this significant amount of infrastructure investment in what we call West Cloud. And what was the number one complaint about it was too slow. It wasn't business agile. It wasn't meeting the needs of the business. Essentially, it was a set of loosely coupled services without any real strategy. This, it's held together by a series of scripts, a lot of local knowledge from individuals, and so on and so forth. And so the ask that I was gotten was, how do you actually bring that entire infrastructure up so it's actually on par? Making it viable for teams to consider our internal infrastructure as a first-class choice for how they would actually move between public IaaS and our private regulated infrastructure. So that was the first set of requirements that made me have to go out and look for a platform as a service component. And so we went through a process where we looked at all of the players that were on the market. A couple of those players went out of business while we were actually in the process, so that was kind of making the short list that much shorter. When we finally came down to a selection decision between Red Hat's OpenShift and Pivotal's Cloud Foundry. And I went through a process where we were basically building out strategy statement and position statements, the theory of action, and then what our investment thesis would look like. And one of the things that I actually said was, all right, I now need to have somebody that has the technical chops to be able to get into that. Bringing Don onto the team, he and I worked together in another organization previously. I was able to now have a technical leader to be able to work with the various teams to be able to run an objective, defensible proof of concept and selection process that we could then bring up to our senior leadership and board. And that was really important for us to be able to take that forward.
And we really wanted to not just give you a tool, but give you the ability to use it in the best way. Because either of those two things, we had teams that went to Agile and then they tried to use West Cloud as their infrastructure. And if it takes you 60 days to get a VM, it's pretty hard to have a week-long sprint that does anything.
Yeah, so our journey started out, cloud was a bad word inside our organization. Anytime it came up, somebody would actually have to really kind of put what they were doing behind the scenes. So one of the things that we saw was that some teams considered 2 releases a year adequate for their needs, and some teams were releasing every 3 weeks. What was the number one difference between those? Those that ran in our infrastructure were very slow, dealing with a lot of the patching aspects of how they actually had to move through some of these processes. You saw the governance load and what I would call the frozen middle of the organization. So you had senior leadership that was like, hey, everything's going great, we're going over here. And then the line level, the teams are like, yeah, we're stoked to do some new different things. And there was an entire layer that was started with the word no. You know, you can't, you won't, you shall not, blah, blah, blah. And they would throw governance, compliance, regulation, all these kind of things up in front of this. And so I had the luxury of joining the organization. I came out of one of these cloud native organizations, and I've been an agilist through my career, basically since probably about the mid-2000s, and really saw this as kind of an anti-pattern for what we wanted to accomplish. Even in our operational technologies, which run 911 or run our GIS business or any of these other things that are highly dependent and regulated, there was no reason that they didn't operate in a more nimble manner. So what we ended up doing was, we had these exemplars that were running in AWS, running in Azure, and then in some cases running in Rackspace or other organizations. A lot of when they were outside, they were able to move pretty quick. When they were inside, they would slow down pretty significantly. But ultimately, what we were able to do is have a different strategy statement. So the first thing I said is everybody can come out of the shadows. You have the ability to we give everyone amnesty to be able to recover their applications, be able to understand what's going on in the portfolio, and be able to learn from it. And that was something that was very important as we started to go and say, hey, look, cloud is not a bad term. I know that most of you, show of hands, how many people does this story resonate with? Okay, good. So I'm okay. And how many are you like, oh my God, I don't ever want to work there? Okay, because I came in, so I came out of one of these teams that was very forward-looking, moving very fast, got brought into the corporation or corporate CIO's office, and the first thing I said is, oh my God, I don't want to work in this environment. How do we make the culture change so people can see that product development teams are where the money is made in the organization? The further you are away from the customer, the less value you have to the organization. And I think that's something that's a very different kind of approach.
And because we have these very important applications, for us, having both a high availability platform as well as a way to easily make applications high availability was a big plus for us that we were looking for. And True HA requires you to be fluid in also scaling your platform and your applications, because if you can't bring your application up to scale, you're never satisfying your demand. And we also wanted to provide a place where logging and monitoring were part of the deal already. We had huge disparities between our different applications in terms of how they could debug problems, what people outside the immediate circle could see in terms of the KPIs for the application, et cetera, and we wanted to democratize that a little bit more. As well as we wanted to be able to provide more agile, adaptive security, a much more modern stance, not just set up firewall rules once and hope everything works, but have a system that would support us in security in depth and the ability to make changes quickly, repave a system if needed, if it was compromised, et cetera. Another of our issues was that each of our environments was very different from each other. People were working on their local machines for dev and then going onto hardware for QA testing and then going into the West Cloud for production, which was a completely different set. And everyone had their own network rules, et cetera. And we needed something that when you had tested it as a developer, you felt certain it was going to work in QA, and if it passed there, there was no question it was going to run in production. And lastly, we wanted to have that ability to move beyond our own private data center. For now, many of our core workloads are in there, but we want that ability to make that a choice of the business rather than a choice of the application, where they're going to run. We should be able to figure out the best place for each of the apps to run in terms of what services they need, what connectivity they need, data residency rules, et cetera. So we had a lot of initiatives to start out. When Thomas joined, we needed to change a lot of things in the organization. And after talking through it, we really decided that having a cloud native platform was really going to be our keystone because it addresses so many of the issues that we were having in terms of acquisition of resources, the ability to do pervasive automation across build and deployment and production, true high availability, scaling, application monitoring, security, dev, test, production equivalence, and that ability to move the workloads wherever we thought they should go.
So can you go back one?
Yep.
So a little bit about this. So one of the things that we talk about the acquisition by the private equity firm. So one of the things that was really important to us was, when we were a publicly held company, we had to take, my running joke was I was the executive crash test dummy. I had to run at the same wall every day. Occasionally a little piece would chip off. I'd get up the next morning, I'd have to run at the same wall again and try to get these people to understand that there's a difference in the way we were working, the why we needed to do what we needed to do, and so on and so forth. So what happened when the transaction was announced, the Apollo Group agreed to make a significant investment in the organization. And because we were a technology-driven company, and what we saw was that we were what they call an undervalued asset, meaning that we had a lot of really good technology. We hadn't taken the opportunity to consolidate our platforms or go after any of the efficiencies around that. But they saw this as an opportunity if they made an investment, for each dollar in, they would be able to get a dollar of greater productivity out of the organization. So that was a big part of this. And the cloud native platform, our selection around Pivotal Cloud Foundry, was ultimately how are we going to not just put a tool in place, but how are we going to transform the culture around this? Because as a key initiative, it wasn't just standing up the tool. It's essentially how do you change the behaviors of teams? And one of the things that folks really enjoyed about leveraging the public IaaS environment was that they controlled their own infrastructure. They were able to provision what they needed. They were able to take advantages of services. They didn't necessarily go through this significant amount of governance load and so on and so forth. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we wanted to be able to do is give them this infrastructure that they could take advantage of. And then, as Don said, move between any environment and then also commingle services like whether Cosmos, Dynamo, Nois, various things, Big Data, or Big Table and BigQuery, things like that, be able to put those right inside. So we were able to separate the infrastructure, the IaaS infrastructure discussion from the cognitive AI/ML discussion versus the big data discussion, and be able to have those whether they're leveraging our environments or they're leveraging environments outside of our four walls.
So now we're getting to the real meat or soy-based protein, because we're in California, so don't want to offend anyone here, of the presentation, which is how do you actually go about making a decision in that case? And our methodology was to do a competitive POC.
We're not doing that, by the way. The blinking is not us.
Is that me? Hands are off the buzzer. And to do that, you want to start out with a good understanding of what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you, V1.
Yes. And during our last slide, we talked about a lot of those things. And as a good engineer, if you can't measure it, it probably doesn't actually exist. So the first thing we wanted to do was build a series of metrics that would describe and measure how these outcomes had changed. And we didn't want just to compare the metrics between the two platforms that we had chosen, but we wanted to also put it up against our current status. This would help us also to build our business case for this investment, which isn't all that small. And then to decide which which platforms we should use, we didn't do it in a little back room all alone. We went out and talked to people within the organization, some of those forward-looking teams, some of the not so forward-looking teams, and solicited information from them. This is an important stage too, because you're trying to build a coalition of people and you're trying to make a group decision. This is, although I'm an architect and therefore I know everything, you still find that the more people
That's actually how I introduced him, by the way.
Yeah.
So,
And then I look at people and they're scared. It's using the breadth of experience within your organization that really leads you to the best possible outcome that you can get.
So let me just speak to that a little bit. So one of the things that when we went through this process, it was really it's an exemplar model. So it's based in what you do with a K-12 system or you do in a higher education system. Basically, we wanted to be able to have those teams that were very low on the maturity curve, meaning that they did not have much interest in doing agile, they didn't have much interest in changing their ways and so on and so forth. Being able to move those teams was just as important as moving these teams that were agile first, able to take advantage of all these things. They were building 12-factor applications before that was even a thing. But then there was the teams in the middle, like how do you actually ensure the gravity is on one side or the other? We wanted to have the opportunity to pull them forward by having them be able to see themselves in this. So I think that at one point we had about 180 people, 180 software engineers and teams working alongside us to be able to do this analysis. But the most important thing was that when we moved from the analysis phase, those team members became our kind of evangelists inside the organization. We didn't have to go out and seek out which teams were going to be first, second, and third to come onto the platform because they had already been part of this POC. And they were like, oh, well, when you do that, whatever you end up doing, we want to be part of that team later on. What was also important is that while we did have quite a few quantitative metrics, the qualitative metrics were also really important because things like when an engineer says that if you select that other platform, I quit, was pretty powerful. Like it wasn't really numerical, but I mean, it was pretty good anecdote for us to kind of work through. But the other thing is that when we also said to teams, one of the questions was, will you adopt this in the next 60 days if we make this purchase? Because we had to identify 10 teams to be able to take advantage. We basically did 5 Foundry, 200 AI, 5 service instances. We're basically planning on putting HA configuration in our private cloud, putting single foundries in each of the major IaaS. And what happened was between the time that we made our initial acquisition of software in Q1 of this year to the point where the acquisition was announced, and then we went what we called deal 2. I'm real creative with this stuff. So deal 2 goes through. Now we've moved to a much larger, much more, enabling all of our hybrid cloud configurations, both in the United States and internationally, as well as also standing up multiple availability zones in the next 24 to 36 months. So, right now we are at the stage where we are in production in our internal environment, but we have every intention of taking advantage of these others. So.
And when we initially announced this POC, that frozen middle that Thomas was talking about, their biggest question was, how will you ever get enough people to use this? They really thought it was going to be shelfware. We'd buy it, we'd install it somewhere, and that would be it. After running the POC, first of all, we took teams from across the country and across the world, in fact, and from different lines of business all across the company to try to do this POC. And what we found was the moment they got into it, they just said, gimme, gimme, gimme.
That made Pivotal happy, by the way. So.
Their question was, will you be able to get this through the bureaucracy of the company? And our answer was, yeah, this time we really have executive sponsorship and we have the technology chops to get it done as well. And so as we moved out of that, we came up with the other problem. We have way more people who want to get onto the platform than then we can ramp in the time that we have. It's important when you're doing this POC, limit the number of choices that you have. To do this right, it takes a lot of time. Well, not that much time, but you got to remember it took a lot of my time, but a couple of days of 3 or 4 developers, that's a lot of time. And so reducing that down and being sure that you're ready to go in and present to them so that they understand what they're doing, that you've already found the workloads that you want to get done, get those in, and then acquire your metrics, do surveys, do any sort of actual metrics from your get accounts, et cetera, and use those to inform your decision.
So the obvious thing is it's not a tool process. So I think that everybody here knows that if it's not about whether or not you put this environment in, it's whether or not it's being used. So we've actually, we have a pretty mature FP&A process inside our IT finance organization. So we actually did Monte Carlo analysis and all these other things. And surprisingly, adoption was the number one thing that was actually going to drive whether or not we captured the business value. So what ends up happening in this is that we have to invest in our tools. We all invest in our teams. And some of our teams would adopt with a conversation, so the very, very low barrier to entry for these teams. And some teams require a significant amount of investment in the dojo process to be able to kind of get them to transform or do a labs visit and be able to be part of a lab event. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to the investment. So our first investment in Pivotal as a product, we did an equal investment in the professional services just to do the enablement necessary for us to be able to get adoption just around those initial 200 AIs. That investment is going to continue because ultimately we have to own this internally. So.
And the idea is that from this, we're going to build a team that we call the Center of Excellence, which is an internal team which is helping our groups do that transformation because we have over 100 forward customer-facing apps and over 500 total applications. So we have a lot of teams to go through, and although we like paying Pivotal's bills, we aren't quite that rich. So we're building this team from within, both part-time and using people from teams who did the previous transformations to be able to get a geometric rather than linear transformation.
So next part of this. So we see this as a journey, not a destination. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, we're thrilled that, for example, PKS being launched today is going to be a big part of where we head. We see this as an opportunity to recover more applications that weren't a part of the original business case. I think that's a powerful thing. By selecting a technology that, in my opinion, is leading the market, ultimately we get to kind of chain ourselves to set. Gautam in the room here calls it the mise en place, or essentially the table setting. We actually want to be able to have the tools necessary for teams to be able to walk in and go and say, hey, this is an organization that's making the right tool selections, they're putting the right technologies in front of us, they're able to ultimately be able to take advantage of that. So, yes, we are hiring, okay, just like everybody else. We have 22 locations globally. The majority of the positions that we have are actually in North America. We have 75 open positions right now that we're hiring for. We are a conferencing company. We're distributed by nature. We have a great opportunity for folks to work with us. The important thing about this is that we are no longer the organization that we described at the beginning of this process. We've actually reorganized the product development organizations to be part of our IT organization. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're very excited about the journey that we're on. We hope that some of you will be willing to come and join us with it. We'll be taking questions outside after the event or after this presentation is over. But with that, Don and I would like to say thank you for your time.
Thank you.